The bullet had shattered Maximilien Robespierre's jaw so completely that fragments of bone slipped from his mouth whenever he tried to speak. It was a grotesque silence forced upon the man who had once thundered in the halls of the Convention, the silence of a broken tyrant. Yet to understand how this self-proclaimed incorruptible found himself gagged by blood and agony, we must step back into the years when France trembled at the echo of his voice and lived or died by the flick of his pen. By 1792, Robespierre had transformed from an idealistic provincial lawyer into the very embodiment of revolutionary zeal. His belief was absolute. The revolution was not just politics, but a moral crusade, and in his eyes, morality had only two categories: virtue and corruption. Anyone who disagreed with him was an enemy of the people. Anyone who questioned his methods was a traitor. Mercy was weakness, and weakness could not be tolerated in a nation remaking itself in blood and fire. In April 1793, the Committee of Public Safety was formed. Within 6 months, Robespierre had turned it into the most efficient killing machine Europe had ever seen. The committee met at 9 o'clock each morning in a chamber overlooking the Seine. By 10, the day's executions were decided. The decisions were cold, precise, bureaucratic names, scribbled down as if tallying debts rather than lives. The numbers tell the story of a nation consumed. Between September 1793 and July 1794, the Revolutionary Tribunal sentenced 2,639 people to death in Paris alone. In Lyon, 1,880 were executed. In Toulon, 282. But statistics cannot capture the horror of Nantes, where prisoners were bound together, herded onto barges, and sunk in the Loire River. There, mass drownings replaced the guillotine, because the blade simply could not keep pace with the demand for death. For weeks afterward, swollen corpses bobbed along the current, washing ashore 30 kilometers downstream. Towns untouched by revolutionary soldiers still awoke to the stench of rotting bodies drifting past their banks. What made this even more chilling was Robespierre's meticulous obsession with order. Every execution was documented with the precision of a clerk balancing accounts. Names, ages, occupations, and alleged crimes were entered into reports and accountant's ledger of death. A baker who charged too much for bread, guillotine. A priest who refused loyalty to the state, guillotine. A woman who muttered about food shortages, guillotine. A boy of 14 who dared cry, "Long live the king," during a street quarrel, guillotine. Even a pregnant woman who begged only to live long enough to give birth denied, executed the same day. Each morning, guards recited Robespierre's lists to prisoners crammed into cells built for half their number. Faces drained of hope, the condemned were loaded onto carts. The journey from prison to scaffold took exactly 45 minutes, a macabre ritual repeated with mechanical efficiency. Crowds hurled insults, stones, even human waste. For them, the executions had become both punishment and entertainment, theatre and revenge. At the Place de la executioner Charles Henry Sanson performed with grim expertise, head into the lunette, blade raised, the crowd counting down from 10, then silence as the severed head tumbled into its wicker basket. A moment later, cheers erupted, and the next body was dragged forward. Each corpse was thrown into a pit, smothered in quicklime and forgotten. Robespierre himself rarely attended, but he demanded detailed accounts. He wanted to know not only who had died, but how they died. What were their final words? Did they cry out, beg, or face the blade with stoic calm? In his private journals, he recorded these details with disturbing fascination, as though measuring the strength of his enemies' souls. When Marie Antoinette mounted the scaffold in October 1793, Robespierre noted with cold detachment that her composure showed she had never understood the suffering of the French people. When his former ally Georges Danton pleaded for mercy before the blade in April 1794, Robespierre wrote that such weakness revealed Danton's corruption. The irony is that the people called Robespierre the Incorruptible. He was admired for his austere lifestyle, his refusal to accept bribes, his simple clothes, and his unwavering devotion to principle. But incorruptibility, in his hands, became terrifying. It meant rigidity without mercy, principle without compassion. To him, compromise was corruption, tolerance was betrayal, and so he built a republic where the highest virtue was obedience to his vision. The France of the Terror was a place where suspicion infected daily life. Neighbors denounced neighbors, children reported their parents, whispers in all markets could end in a midnight arrest. Newspapers screamed propaganda, filling pages with lists of traitors and warnings of plots. Even laughter became dangerous. To joke about shortages, to sigh for the past, even to remain silent when others shouted revolutionary slogans, any of these could be fatal. And behind it all was Robespierre, presiding like a priest over a religion of fear. But fear is not stable. The more lives were claimed, the easier it became to justify the next death. The threshold lowered again and again until killing was as casual as stamping a form. In the name of saving the revolution, Robespierre had transformed it into a factory of death, a factory he managed with the chilling discipline of a bureaucrat. And though the guillotine stood in the open air of Paris, its shadow stretched into every home, every whisper, every breath of a people too afraid to speak. This was the Republic of Virtue as Robespierre defined it, one in which thousands died not because of what they had done, but because of what they represented. And while the Incorruptible believed he was sculpting the soul of France, the truth was simpler. He had constructed a machine that devoured its own people, and soon that same machine would turn on him. By early 1794, the man who had once embodied revolutionary hope was visibly crumbling beneath the weight of the very terror he had unleashed. Robespierre, the eloquent lawyer from Arras, was now a sleepless spectre pacing the halls of Paris. He often slept no more than 3 hours a night, and his body betrayed the strain. A nervous twitch plagued his left eye, making him blink uncontrollably during speeches. His voice, once clear and persuasive, had grown shrill and high-pitched, cracking as though strangled by the tension he carried. He withdrew from society, appearing only at official ceremonies, and when he did, whispers spread that he seemed to be speaking less to the crowd than to invisible opponents only he could hear. His landlord's daughter later testified that she often awoke at night to the sound of him pacing endlessly, rehearsing speeches to empty chairs, arguing with phantoms of enemies, real and imagined. He carried a loaded pistol everywhere he went into committee meetings, placing it on the table beside his papers as though daring anyone to challenge him. His handwriting, once elegant, now collapsed into erratic scrawls. Documents show blotches of ink where he pressed too hard, whole sentences crossed out, margins cluttered with notes no one else could decipher. Again and again, he wrote the same chilling phrase, "The Republic of Virtue will triumph." Sometimes he filled entire pages with it, repeating the mantra like a prayer to ward off the shadows gathering around him. But shadows alone cannot topple a tyrant, laws do. In June 1794, Robespierre introduced the law of 22 prairial, perhaps the most terrifying legislation of the revolution. Trials could be concluded in as little as 15 minutes. The accused were denied legal counsel. There were only 2 possible verdicts: acquittal or death. No defense, no appeals, no mercy. The guillotine, already busy, now accelerated its pace. Executions in Paris tripled overnight, leaping from 5 a day to 15. Even those who had long stood by Robespierre began to murmur uneasily, for if guilt required no proof, then no one, not even his allies, was safe. It was then that the revolution began to devour itself in earnest. Deputies who had once cheered him in the convention now whispered that their own names could be next. They had seen too many colleagues denounced for hesitation, for doubt, for silence. Each man knew that if Robespierre suspected betrayal, death would follow within hours. And so, in hushed apartments lit by a single candle, they plotted. Joseph, the ruthless survivor; Paul Barras, sharp-eyed and ambitious; Jean-Lambert Tallien, whose mistress had herself been threatened by Robespierre's wrath. They gathered in secret, calling their conspiracy the necessary action. Their goal was stark: kill Robespierre before he killed them. They needed only to persuade enough deputies that the Incorruptible was preparing mass arrests. The rest would be momentum, fear turning against its master. The morning of July 27, 1794, began like any other day of terror. Robespierre rose at dawn, reviewed reports from provincial committees, and prepared to deliver yet another defense of his policies. Dressed in his trademark blue coat and powdered wig, he still believed in the supremacy of his voice, convinced that his rhetoric could bend the assembly to his will as it had so many times before. But that afternoon, as he entered the hall of the National Convention, the air was charged with something new: defiance. 43 deputies had signed a secret pact to denounce him the moment he spoke, and when he arose to defend himself, they struck. "Down with the tyrant," one shouted. "You are the enemy of the people," cried another. For the first time in 3 years, the convention roared against him, not with applause but with condemnation. His voice faltered. The rhythmic chant of death to Robespierre rose from every corner, drowning him. He tried to argue, but the deputies had found their courage. They shouted him down, stripping him of the silence that had once fallen whenever he lifted his hand. The spell was broken. Guards surged forward. "You cannot arrest virtue," Robespierre shouted, his arms restrained. "I am the representative of the people." But the people's representatives dragged him from the chamber as crowds outside erupted with cheers, loud enough to be heard 6 streets away. Paris had turned. The prisons that had once overflowed with his victims now refused to hold him. The Luxembourg rejected him, terrified to house such a dangerous prisoner. The conciergerie where Marie Antoinette had spent her last days shut its gates. For hours he was shuttled from one prison to another, each warden slamming the door in his face. It was a grotesque reversal. The man who had signed so many arrest orders now found every cell closed to him. Finally, he was taken to the Hôtel de Ville, where his brother Augustin and loyalists gathered in desperation. Inside, Robespierre drafted what he believed would be his final, triumphant speech, a defense of his life and his cause. He was certain the people of Paris would rise for him once they understood what was happening. He had seen them overthrow kings, storm prisons, and chant his name in the streets. Surely, he thought, they would rise again. But as night fell, the silence of Paris told another story. The sans-culottes stayed home. The National Guard met the crowds with little resistance, for there were almost no crowds at all. The city that once had followed him into terror now turned its face away. The Incorruptible was alone, waiting in a chamber filled not with allies but with ghosts. By 2:00 a.m. it was clear no one was coming to save him. In the early hours of July 28, 1794, the Hôtel de Ville trembled with panic. Armed forces of the convention stormed the building, their boots pounding the wooden floors as they closed in on Robespierre and his remaining supporters. Shots rang out in the chaos. Witnesses would never agree on the exact truth. Some claimed Robespierre tried to take his own life with the pistol he carried so obsessively, but failed. Others swore a gendarme fired by accident. Still others whispered that a young soldier, Charles Murder, deliberately aimed for him. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. The bullet ripped through Robespierre's mouth, shattering his lower jaw. He fell onto a table, choking, blood spilling down his coat, his once commanding voice reduced to a strangled gurgle. The man who had silenced thousands was himself silenced, his final words lost in a howl of pain. Yet death did not come quickly. Bandages torn from a tablecloth were wound clumsily around his mangled face. He was hauled to the Committee of Public Safety, ironically, the very chamber where he had sentenced so many others. There, for 14 endless hours, Robespierre endured the torment he had inflicted upon thousands, the certainty of death. Without knowing the precise moment it would arrive, his body slumped in a chair, head bound in bloody linen, jaw dangling in grotesque ruin. Colleagues walked past, some sneering, some silent, but all aware that terror had at last devoured its master. By dawn, Paris knew his fate. Word spread faster than fire, and by 6 o'clock, the squares were packed. Street vendors hawked bread, wine, and fruit to spectators who treated the coming execution like a holiday. Children played mock guillotine, shoving each other to the ground and pretending their heads had rolled. Women knitted calmly, as they had through hundreds of executions before, their needles clacking in rhythm with the anticipation of the crowd. But this gathering was different. These were not merely bloodthirsty onlookers. These were people who had lived in dread, who had seen neighbors vanish overnight, who had whispered their prayers in silence for fear of being denounced. They came not to watch another death, but to witness freedom, the end of the man who had held their lives in his lists. At 4 in the afternoon, Robespierre and 21 of his closest allies were loaded onto the death carts. The journey to the Place de l'Art usually lasted 45 minutes. This time it took nearly 2 hours, slowed by mobs eager to spit, to throw refuse, to hurl insults at the fallen tyrant. "There goes the monster," they shouted. "Look at the tyrant now." Children ran alongside, striking him with sticks, trying to tear at the bandages on his face. His blue coat was stained with blood, his famous white wig gone, his hair prematurely grey from months of sleepless paranoia. He could not hold up his head. It drooped forward, his chin pressed to his chest. The man who had once reduced assemblies to silence with a glance could now barely lift his eyes to meet his accusers. When the carts finally reached the scaffold, the sound of the crowd was deafening. 200,000 voices packed into every window, rooftop, and street corner. Some had paid dearly for the best vantage points. Others clung to lamp posts, straining for a glimpse. The air trembled with a feverish anticipation that bordered on joy. Then came the moment no one forgot. As executioners dragged Robespierre forward, they ripped away the filthy bandages that had bound his jaw for 14 hours. His shattered face gaped open, and he let out a scream so raw, so inhuman, that the crowd fell silent for a heartbeat. It was as if all the cries of his victims had been distilled into a single, agonized howl. One voice finally broke the hush. "That is the scream of all his victims." And with that, the square erupted in cheers that shook the very stones. The blade fell. Robespierre's head tumbled into the basket. The Incorruptible was gone, dispatched with the same cold efficiency he had demanded of thousands. But the crowd did not disperse. Instead, Paris exploded in celebration. People danced in the streets, toasted strangers, sang songs mocking the fallen dictator. Vendors sold scraps of cloth they swore were stained with his blood. In Lyon, citizens lit bonfires and hurled effigies of him into the flames. In Marseille, church bells pealed for 6 unbroken hours, ships firing their cannons in jubilation. Across France, wine was poured freely, as if a nation drunk on terror had at last sobered into relief. And just as suddenly as the terror had begun, it ended. The Revolutionary Tribunal was dissolved. The law of 22 Prairial was repealed. Executions halted. Prisons that had been overflowing began to empty so quickly that guards stood bewildered in their new silence. Markets reopened, food returned. Churches, long shuttered or desecrated, welcomed worshippers again. Newspapers rediscovered their freedom, publishing stories unchained from state propaganda. It was as though a city of 3 million souls had been holding its breath for months and now exhaled at once. On July 29th, the guillotine stood idle for the first time in 10 months. No one was sentenced. The following day, again, silence. The machine that had ruled Paris with its steady rhythm of falling blades was dismantled. Its carts rolled away. The Republic of Virtue had devoured its creator, and in doing so, had exhausted its appetite for blood. Robespierre's body, along with those of his allies, was dumped into a mass grave in the Dare, smothered in quicklime, unmarked, unremembered. Within years, houses and shops covered the ground. The man who had recorded the names of thousands with obsessive precision vanished without a trace, buried in earth that cared nothing for his ideals or his terror. This was the final irony. Robespierre, who believed violence could purify, who claimed virtue justified the blade, who argued that terror itself was an instrument of justice, died realizing the monster he had fed was never his to command. Each death had made the next easier, until killing was routine, until fear itself was law. And when the law turned, it consumed him without hesitation. His last scream, torn from a shattered jaw, was the truest testimony of his reign. It was not the voice of the Incorruptible, not the voice of reason or virtue, but the voice of a man devoured by his own creation. The terror was over, not from forgiveness, nor from mercy, but simply because the man who had made himself indispensable to death was no longer needed. And so Maximilien Robespierre, who had risen on principle and ruled through fear, died, bewildered, abandoned, and alone astonished that the revolution had gone on without him. If this story kept you hooked, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the next dark chapter of history.